This computer. Okay, here we go. Okay, so welcome back to Cracks in Postmodernity. We're here with Joseph Bottum, who is the director of the Classics Institute at Dakota State University. So tell us a little bit more about your background, your work, for those who aren't yet familiar with you.
Well, I've been kind of a layabout, or at least a jack of all trades, a generalist. So I've written, a children's book that won the Christopher Medal. I've published 2 books of poetry. My doctorate is in medieval philosophy, but I'm running an institute at a computer-oriented school that's primarily directed at understanding the computer revolution from the perspective of the humanities. So I wander around doing a bunch of different stuff. And the astonishment, of course, is that I've been allowed to get away with it because we typically live in such a specialized age that nobody gets to say, oh, this year I'm going to be interested in cyber ethics. But it's been a lot of fun over the years. I taught for a little bit after I finished graduate school, and then I went into magazine work. I was the literary editor for years and years at the Weekly Standard. I edited a magazine. I was editor-in-chief of a magazine in New York. And then I retired out here to where I live now, which is the Black Hills of South Dakota.
Oh, wow.
And recently the state university system asked me to go over to the computer-oriented college and start up this kind of counter program. They felt like they needed somebody on campus who was willing to say maybe this whole social media thing was a mistake, and it wasn't entirely rah-rah for the computer revolution. So I've been organizing programs for them and maybe a degree program down the road. But of course, over the last year and a half, it's all been online because of the COVID lockdowns.
Mm-hmm.
So my interests, though, one of my primary interests all along has been American religion, and especially the sociology of American religion. We haven't had a lot of great, truly world-class theologians in the history of America. We've had some very fine public intellectual theologians, from Niebuhr to Richard John Newhouse. But we haven't had a lot of the kind of people who would rank up in the highest class, apart from Jonathan Edwards, and at the time of the Great Awakening. Mm-hmm. So what is most interesting in American religion is its sociology. And that has fascinated me for many years, and I've collected string on it for many years. And in 2015, it issued in a book called An Anxious Age.
Yes, and that is how I first discovered your work. And that book opened up a lot of doors and a lot of questions also for me. So the book that came out in 2014, right? An Anxious Age. So the subtitle is The Post-Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of America. So tell us a little bit about what is the main thesis of the book and how did you end up deciding to write it?
Well, the thesis of the book is that the new leftism, to a large degree, somewhat on the right, but that this kind of new spirits of activism that I was seeing, really crystallized for me when a magazine hired me to write an essay on the Occupy Wall Street movement. Mm-hmm. And I went down and interviewed all those people, hung out with them, ended up not writing the piece and having to eat my own expenses because I just couldn't get clear on what I wanted to say in an essay about them. And I realized down the road that what I was perceiving in them was an enormous spiritual anxiety. Mm. They wanted the world to be different than it was. In theological language, they saw that the world lies in sin aborning. They see this condition. And to ask them for specific policies, would be to offend them. They said, we can't give you specific policies because that's a betrayal of our movement for the 99%. which has to be never ending. And I thought, if only they could see that this is a religious language,
Yeah.
right? And what they're expressing is spiritual anxiety. And then I went back and I read Max Weber again,
Yes.
who I hadn't read since I was, an undergraduate. But I went back and read him very seriously. Everything I could get my hands on. I did a deep dive into Weber. And of course, the subtitle of An Anxious Age is very much modeled on Weber, right? It's this Protestant ethic. It's the spirit of America that I was trying to discern. And I realized that American religious history brought us to this point. In the book, I argue what I call the Erie Canal Thesis of American history, which in its particularity is about how all American religion ends up passing through upstate New York, from the Mormons to the spiritualists to the table tappers and the Great Awakening and the revival movements. It's all out of upstate New York. So that the lines of American religion expand out of the Protestants and then constrict again to go through upstate New York in the 19th century and then explode on the rest of America. That's the narrow, specific part of the Erie Canal thesis of American history. The broader thesis is simply this, that the question you have to ask yourself to understand any moment of American history is, what is the state of Protestant religion? And the state of Protestant religion in our own age is an utterly de-churched, utterly apparently secularized spiritual and moral movement that seeks goals that can only be understood spiritually. It seeks belonging. It seeks to understand that its members are good people. And they have that question, am I a good person, with the same anxiety with which Dutch Calvinists would have asked, are they saved? It is fundamentally the same question. It's just the same question put in terms of a world in which you're not allowed to, and you don't even know, to phrase it supernaturally. And this is where I perceive this Occupy Wall Street movement to be coming from. I thought they were recreating apocalyptic and reformist religious movements from the history of Protestantism without knowing that that was what they were doing. And they were doing so down two paths. One, as I like to put it, is morphological. These are perpetual possibilities for human behavior. And we see that shape. You can see that shape among the Khmer Rouge. You can see that shape among the radical Anabaptists, violent radical Anabaptists, which is not a phrase one gets to say often enough, right? But the radical violent Anabaptists of the Munster Rebellion. And you can see it in America. It's a perpetual possibility for human behavior. It's a shape of sociological shape. At the same time, in America, it's not just a shape that could happen anywhere. It's a shape whose limits are defined, are given reality by a history. There's a genealogical descent down to these people from the Puritans and then through upstate New York. And this is, I trace it through the social gospel movement in the late 19th, early 20th centuries. And I say they are the heirs, and they are occupying positions in the society that were exactly what the mainline Protestants used to occupy, or at least some of these post-Protestants are, so that they have the same conditions and the same spiritual anxieties and the same conviction of their own moral rightness. To a certain extent, then the radicals are rebelling against their own post-Protestant parents, saying you're hypocrites. You say you believe in climate change, but you're hypocrites about being radical enough about it. And yet that is the children of the mainline Protestants rebelling against their parents because their parents were insufficiently Christian. We're seeing this pattern again and again.
Now this is interesting because I read your book right after I finished undergrad, and I was in a university in Manhattan, and I think Occupy happened when I think I was a sophomore when it's first started around Wall Street. But more generally, in a lot of my classes and just in conversations with classmates, like I started to see that there is a real fervor, real fervor towards these social issues, to the point of, I mean, there's something very zealous about it. The way that people became very self-righteous if you said the wrong things, or like I just saw this tendency to want to prove how righteous people are. And at that time, I didn't really have the means to articulate what I was perceiving, that there was something very religious, and actually puritanical about it. But when I first read your book, I started to realize, wait, no, this is something religious. Perhaps they may not identify as religious or associate themselves with some kind of institution, but the ethic, the ethos of it is. And I think, yeah, like eventually I started to read other authors who are kind of building on Weber's thesis, but Weber saw this very early on. And
Well,
it's
he saw some of the problems
yeah,
of
not
this
all.
kind of the way in which Protestantism develops. A Protestantism which, in the hands of Luther and Calvin, thought it was setting you free from anxiety. Right. And then he describes how anxiety makes this sort of backdoor return.
It makes its way back. Yeah.
But, that underutilized device of sociological or topic of sociological analysis, which is spiritual anxiety. Mm-hmm. Weber understood its reality. And in the years since, there have been a handful of people who do, notably Peter Berger, sure, the great sociologist Peter mm-hmm. Berger. But in those long years since, which is now over a century, it's generally dropped out as a tool for understanding sociological tides. Mm-hmm. And you can see hints of it in Tocqueville. You can see hints of it here and there. Peter Berger worked on it, as I said, but it really started to come back, the phenomenon. And we lack the sociological tools to understand it, sociological tools that Weber had shouted at us about.
So what happened to that? How did that get lost?
Partly because the secularizers thought that spiritual anxiety was a social construct that you could get rid of. Mm. That wasn't native to human beings. It was something just, that awful thing of Christianity created, and we could just dismiss it. Now, Weber had shown that the attempt to dismiss it in the magisterial Protestant reformers actually allowed it to sneak back in, because you can never be sure that you're actually saved. But you also don't have works righteousness anymore. You can't give the money to the monastery to help your salvation. Mm-hmm. So what do? It piles up into, you can't spend it because ostentatious spending is immoral. So it piles up into pools of capital, which then has to be invested, and we get capitalism out of the Protestant Reformation. Mm-hmm. This is the thesis of the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism, which I have to say, Stephen, is a fun and somewhat impish book.
Yeah.
Because what he's doing is he's taking the Marxist analysis that says the burghers and the people living outside the wall suddenly got new wealth and it broke against the throne and altar understanding of economics and politics. And they weren't ready to break with Christianity, but they needed a new Christianity. Mm-hmm. So we got the Reformation because of the economic changes. And Max Weber comes along and says, you know what? I'm going to stand you on your head. You think that economics caused the Protestant Reformation? The Protestant Reformation caused capitalism. And he just turns the whole analysis upside down. Yeah. It's a very impish book, given the dominance of Marxist analysis, even in his own time. It's a very impish inversion of Marx. And Weber was a kind of impish guy intellectually, so it's not surprising. But with that in hand, with his understanding that spiritual anxiety is a fact inside all of us. Some people feel it very little, some people feel it a lot, but you cannot get rid of it simply by saying, well, the spiritual is unreal. And the secularists thought you could. Why did we suppose that all those people would leave the mainline Protestant churches, which have collapsed, and take nothing with them? What they took with them was a way of understanding the world. This is that genealogical path toward understanding where we are now out of the roots of American Protestantism. What they took with them was a kind of social gospel understanding of the world, that sins are not individual, they're social. They're committed at the level of governments, they're committed at the level of societies. And yes, you shouldn't participate in them. But as Rauschenbusch, the great social gospel theologian, said, the notion that Christ died for the sake of reforming a Tennessee miner who beats his wife is ridiculous.
Yeah.
He died for, and he bore on his body the marks of 6 or 7 great social sins. And as I was reading that, I thought 2 things. One, we now have a very clear path by which mainline Protestantism becomes the post-Protestants. And 2, we have an astonishing coherence of goals for the social gospel movement and the current agitators. The first path is simply, I describe it in the book like this. Rauschenbusch was a Christian. I mean, we don't get anywhere denying his Christianity or denying his really superior biblical and theological knowledge. We don't get anywhere just dismissing that. But why didn't it pass on? Why does it decline in every generation of a social gospel church until people stop going to church? And my analysis was, in the social gospel movement, this is a metaphor from Wittgenstein, Christ is essentially the ladder.
Okay.
We use him to climb to a higher ledge of moral understanding. Right? He bore on his body the social sins, and he taught us what they were. And we climb on that ladder to a higher ledge of social understanding, at which point, to use Wittgenstein's metaphor, we don't need the ladder anymore.
Sounds a little Hegelian to me. That we've evolved past this phase, this momentary phase.
Right. And, you know, without buying Hegelian history and the thesis and antithesis stuff, I think we can say, here's an actual example of the logic that didn't seem important to Rauschenbusch will seem important to people on. Why do you have to be in church? If you've already got the elevated view of morality, what does going to church do for you? What does personal belief in Christ do for you? You just don't need it anymore.
Okay, because if sin is then mainly a social issue, then I don't need an experience of salvation. I don't need to participate. Sure. Okay. So then we're talking about Weber, Rauschenbusch, but if we step back a little bit, I'm curious to hear more about de Tocqueville's take on the mainline churches, because I know you mentioned him in the book. What did he have to say? What did he observe about these churches?
Well, I think Tocqueville saw, I quote in the book a line that I love from Norman Mailer, which goes, most of our national sociology is a desperate attempt to say something about America that Tocqueville hadn't already said. And, you know, there's something sort of Tocqueville just sees all of it. And in a sentence or two, he mentions what would be a fruitful line for 20 years of American sociology. And he's just like 2 sentences and I'm on to something else. Tocqueville understood and saw that the American Protestant churches were wildly divided. there are at least 15 different forms of Baptists, from two seed in the Spirit Baptist to Time River Baptist to, just double doctrine or double predestination Baptist. There's this whole, and they hate each other, or at least they are in strong theological dispute with one another. And not one of them believes what the other believes. And yet, out of them, Tocqueville said, there emerges the central current of American manners and morals.
Wow.
So that however much they disputed, in fact, their theological disputations, their strongly felt theological disputations, add to this unified sense of America, because what they gave America, just considered sociologically, is a pattern of marriages, baptisms, funerals, the shape of life that they gave us, right? And that system of manners and morals is what they gave America. It is the great Mississippi running down through the center of our culture, of our society. And one can see why, since they are dealing, after all, with these fundamental human things: how you marry, how you bring up your children, how you die, and how we remember you after death. Since they are concerned primarily with those things and are relatively unconcerned with government, they give a shape to American life that then becomes this, system of manners and morals with which government has to deal. Government can't really reform it because it's extra governmental. Now, he thinks that that's what the Protestant churches gave America. And America, in my analysis of Tocqueville, which, I would look to Josh Mitchell, some real Tocquevillians, Peter Berkowitz, Harvey Mansfield, some really serious Tocqueville scholars, before I would assert this strongly. But my reading of Tocqueville in this context is that Tocqueville is saying, in essence, we got in the United States the sociological equivalent of a state church without the political burden of a state church.
Okay.
Because they combined to provide the advantages of a state church. But of course, nobody wanted a state church, because where you had one, where you had the Episcopalians as the state church, the Congregationalists objected, and where you had the Congregationalists, the Methodists objected. So nobody, the American religious freedom, if you look at the Danbury documents and the Virginia House of Burgess stuff and all the early discussions of religious freedom, very little of it is that Jeffersonian, that one-off Jeffersonian line about a wall of separation. Most of it is about is coming from the churches. It's the churches who don't want a state church because they're afraid they'll be the ones on the outside of it.
Yeah.
So we kind of back into religious freedom out of the churches. It's the movement comes from the churches. And that's a really interesting sociological effect, which Tocqueville saw and understood that at its best, we ended up with the advantages of a state church without the disadvantages of a state church. Now, Tocqueville, remember, is a French aristocratic Catholic. He doesn't think this can last. I mean, it's just wrong theologically. It's wrong in terms of its history and sociology. But he is, this is what makes him brilliant, is he's able to perceive the advantages that it does give this new democracy. So we have the state church. And my argument is the very people who would move from Occupy Wall Street to Black Lives Matters and down the road and tear down statues and so on, that they are members of that state church, even though they don't know it. They are the descendants of the mainline Protestant move from the Puritans, and it still has puritanical elements, from the upstate New York revivalists, and it still has revivalist elements from the burnt over district, from the social gospel movement, and it has a lot of the social gospel movement in it. And they are its current incarnation. this state church, which is, or this feeling of belonging to the state
Yeah.
church.
Yeah. And from when I hear a lot of the discourse out of these kinds of movements, I think there's a great value because they do draw attention to a lot of real problems that perhaps we weren't noticing before or weren't getting addressed. It's just very strange to me that most people will not acknowledge that there is some kind of religious, spiritual fervor behind this. Like it's determined to be so secular, and yet the reality is it's really borrowing from these ideas that are religious, you know. But then what I hear a lot of people saying though is that the last explicitly religious social movement in the US was civil rights, Martin Luther King. Do you think that that is true, that this was the last time that we had activists who were really proclaiming a kind of Christian identity?
The last successful one, sure.
Okay. So do you see, like, where did this break happen? Like you have Martin Luther King, who's revered by many people, is not, you know, is unabashedly Christian and, you know, very much concerned about social issues. How did this disconnect happen after King and after civil rights?
Well, the answer is that the mainline Protestant churches went into terminal decline. 1965, if you include the Black churches, as I think you should, the mainline Protestant churches had just over 50% of Americans belonging to them. Today, that number is probably under 10%. That is a huge sociological change. And at the time I wrote the book, nobody was mentioning it. I thought, you know, how can we just ignore this enormous sociological change? And, you know, we can get into the weeds of analyzing whether the Southern Baptist Convention wants to be a mainline church or an evangelical church. I mean, we can do all that fine granular stuff. But I think in general, we could look to a number of causes, none of them definitive. But, you know, we could talk, it's common here to talk about the rise of television. It's common here to talk about, you know, the decline of the prestige of the theologians in Europe. So Lutherans no longer looked to their magisterial theologians in Europe, or Episcopalians to the English. We could talk about any number of things. But I concentrate in the book on the social gospel movement because I think the logic is clearest there, especially its connection to the later post-Protestants. Because when Rauschenbusch lists 6 social sins, it is exactly the things that are being protested today.
Wow. Okay.
It's militarism. I mean, he's using a different language, but he says it's militarism, it's bigotry, it's the rule by the uneducated mob, and he lists these, and then you look and see, well, if you're now not a protester, right? Mm-hmm. But you're somebody, you have a nice upper middle class job, and you want to think you're a good person.
Yeah.
What do you need to do that? Rauschenbusch said, you need to join the great ganglion chain. He was such a fun writer. We need to join the great ganglion chain of redeemed personalities.
Wow.
Right? So that you don't need to do anything in particular. Mm-hmm. You just have to reform your thinking. You have to say, I don't belong to the militarists. I don't belong to the bigots. I understand myself as someone who perceives the social sins and condemns them.
Okay.
So that it's a matter of self-understanding. Now, if you're a lawyer in Peoria, Illinois, and you make $250,000 a year, you're very successful, and that's upper middle class money in Peoria, right? And you want to know that you're a good person. You have spiritual anxiety because you're a human being, for God's sake. Of course you have spiritual anxiety. How do you perceive of yourself as a good person? Well, you say, I'm not like those other people.
Yeah.
I write a check to the Sierra Club. I vote for the people who are anti-militarists. You express your redeemed personality, and being redeemed in personality is the way he thinks that society gets changed. We get this chain of people who are redeemed in personality, who set themselves against, in their own understanding of themselves, against the social sins.
Mm-hmm.
And once we have enough of them, it begins to influence the society. Well, it does. He turns out to have been right. We have this whole class of people. Now, we could analyze them in a lot of other ways. We could speak about their economic interests and their rent seeking, and all of that can be true or false, and is certainly interesting. But I was trying to tease out this one piece of thread from the tangle. And that one piece of thread is this idea of a redeemed personality as the response to spiritual anxiety. That you're a good person because you're on the right side of things.
Yeah. So, there are parts in the book when you talk about a lot of young people today being drawn to forms of religion that don't have this kind of puritanical orientation towards sin and redemption, rather brands specifically of Christianity that recognize, look, like we're all sinful and we're not going to redeem ourselves. Like it's kind of a waste of time to try to prove how holy we are, because I think some people are coming to terms with the fact that, look, like we're all broken. None of us are pure. Nothing we're going to do is ever going to make us pure enough. What do you see happening amongst young people who are not drawn to this kind of post-Protestant kind of ethic?
Oh, yeah. I mean, we enter here what I would call the great reasonableness of Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
G.K. Chesterton once said, original sin is the only Christian dogma you don't have to believe. You can see that it's true every time you walk down the street.
Yeah.
So that this is this idea that we are broken people. What I perceive is on Twitter, which is its own madness, and social media, is a refusal to accept that.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody, on the one hand, it's accepted in that everybody's vulnerable if you just watch long enough.
Sure.
But there is no forgiveness for being vulnerable. There's no idea that we're all vulnerable together. It's like this hungry mob waiting for somebody to make a misstep so that they can pounce. But I think the really interesting people are the ones who go their own way.
Mm-hmm.
Now, rebellion against rebellion never escapes the problems of rebellion. Those who are rebelling against a rebellious world don't magically recreate tradition. If a tradition gets broken, you don't get it back by wanting to be a tradition or to be traditional. You just get something that's a little eccentric. But I'm interested in those people. But I also think they lost. Mm-hmm. I mean, the second half of the book was really an autobiographical account in certain ways of my time among the neocons. Mm-hmm. And it was an understanding that all these meetings I went to of evangelicals and Catholics together, and this idea that for the leg of support for the American experiment that was the Protestant religions, the mainline Protestant religions, and it had collapsed, leaving us only the economic leg of capitalism and the populist leg of government, that we were going to be able to substitute in this kind of meeting of evangelicals and Catholics. And that project failed. It was a fascinating project, and I was there at all of it. But, I think honesty demands that we say didn't work, right? It failed.
Why didn't it work?
I give several reasons in the book. One is that Catholicism was simply too alien.
Yeah.
And too big in a certain way to just slot in there. That the evangelicals were their own different group, that their theology was a little thin, Their biblical reading was fantastic, but the theology was a little thin, and they didn't have a vocabulary, much as they looked to, what's his name, the Dutch theologian, Kuyper.
Okay.
Much as they looked to Kuyper to try and provide it to them, for them, they, it never quite came together. The Catholic vocabulary didn't mix all that well with them. Evangelicalism has been in decline for a decade now. Mm-hmm. It was a peak moment that passed. All of these add up, but ultimately, I think they lost because the post-Protestants won, just the way the mainline always won. We think that the mainline churches collapsed and that opened a vacuum. And this is a really true and reasonable analysis. The mainline churches collapsed, leaving a hole, a vacuum. And into that got sucked the two largest Christian groups that had always been excluded by the mainline, the evangelicals on one side and the Catholics on the other. And they got sucked in to meet for the first time. I mean, most of the anti-Catholic evangelicals had never met a Catholic.
Wow.
And most of the Catholics didn't even know what an evangelical was. It was all Protestantism to them.
Yeah.
But they met, and it was the issue of abortion that they met over, right? That was the first of these. That was a really interesting meeting, and some interesting sociological and theological stuff came out of it. And by a handful of very smart people, both Catholic and evangelical, there was this interest in finding a way to combine them, not theologically, but sociologically, to provide the new current of manners and morals that the mainline Protestant churches themselves were ceasing to provide. Mm-hmm. So that we would keep the Tocquevillian project going. We would have a diverse religious feeling that provided the benefits of a state church without the disadvantages of a state church. The evangelicals and the Catholics would sort of combine to provide what the Baptist, Methodists, and Presbyterians used to.
Okay, so that's interesting to me because it sounds like the fact that their premise of working together, but also the goals seem very moralistic and not really rooted in a real ontological depth that kind of precedes the moral questions. And I think that's ultimately what made like mainline Protestantism fall apart, because there's no like ontological depth or theological depth. So if, Catholics and evangelicals are banding together to try to, work against this, it's like, okay, but you're kind of playing their game. You're using the same kind of premise, but just with a different emphasis.
Well, if we speak of Protestantism in the history of America, you're absolutely right? Mm-hmm. There were, in fact, shared ontological presuppositions among all those Protestant churches that Tocqueville's observing in the 1830s. Okay. But, their differences were profoundly felt, and they achieved no theological or ontological unity. They just kind of, as they shook down into the National Council of Churches, they basically dismissed theological questions.
Yeah.
And serious ontological questions. But I think the idea behind evangelicals and Catholics together was not that we were going to achieve theological unity. Although the statement on justification, for instance, was,
sure.
We are not as far apart as you may suppose. Hans Kuhn had done the same thing reading Karl Barth years and years before. And Karl Barth couldn't believe it. Karl Barth's, comment on Hans Kuhn's first book on justification was, he has reported me right. This Catholic priest has reported me right. I cannot believe, however, that he got Catholicism right. Because I just know that Catholics don't feel this way about justification. So there was some interesting theological stuff going on there. But you're right. It was a rather cold-blooded attempt to recreate the Tocquevillian synthesis, which was not theological. It was sociological.
Yeah.
Because they knew they weren't going to achieve this. And if anything, both groups had too much theology to, just solve their theological divides. And America was never based on an ontological unity.
Yeah, I think this is the key point because if we're going to try to start some kind of movement or revolution based solely on social issues or moral issues, like that's not enough to sustain or to unite a people. Like there has to be a real ontological depth to have that kind of unity, that kind of change.
Right.
It's
But they were not advocating, I think you're right, but they were not advocating a great awakening.
No.
Now, a great awakening is what you're describing.
Because what I always understood from the Catholic evangelical partnership, most of the things that are coming together on were these moral issues like abortion and sexual morality and all that. And it's like, to me, it's like that's just not powerful enough to unite people. And it's also not to me, I don't find that interesting enough. Like I think what attracts me is a real proposal about the meaning of life, redemption, salvation, sin. Like there has to be something that precedes all of those moral things to really change people, to change a society. And I don't think they really gave enough attention to that.
Right. But the battle they lost was a sociological battle.
Yeah.
I mean, the post-Protestants won. And this Catholic and Evangelicals Together project, or Evangelicals and Catholics Together project, just got defeated. And there are many reasons, including this one, right, that finally it wasn't theologically and ontologically deep. There are many reasons it failed. But let's not ignore the primary reason. The primary reason is that the mainline Protestant, post-Protestants won.
Yeah.
I mean, yes, all that's true, but they captured the colleges, they educated 2 generations, and they used that to win.
So then the last thing I'll ask you then is about, why is it that there are so many people ascribing to this kind of post-Protestant ethic, but don't know it? Like, what are the factors in the education system or in the society at large that kind of blind so many of us to this reality?
Yeah, we could, again, this is a tangle, and we could kind of tease out certain threads. One thread I think I mentioned to you was the decline of American studies. Now, remember, American studies was a new discipline. It emerged in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, right, in American colleges. So somebody like Tom Wolfe went and got his doctorate in American studies. I'm sure that some of these programs still exist, but they don't occupy this space that they once did. And it was the American studies movement that urged us to look to the Puritans, right? That said, we are forgetting what Hawthorne knew. We are forgetting what, Hawthorne, who comes relatively late. We are forgetting what generations of American school children used to know, that it really did all start on Plymouth Rock. We're forgetting the puritanical origin of America. And then the Great Awakening, which gave, an expression of Christianity out of Massachusetts. I mean, Edwards was in Northampton. Gave this expression of American Christianity. We're forgetting our religious history, so that when we start to have religious impulses, we don't have a vocabulary or a history in which to set them.
Yeah.
Now, that's only one thread in this tangle. The constant pressure of intellectualized secularism, the idea that American, when I was young in college, American exceptionalism was always taught in terms of religion. Okay. American exceptionalism is the fact that America doesn't seem to be undergoing the same species or speed of secularism that Europe is undergoing. Okay. That was what was meant by American exceptionalism. We are not retracing the path of Europe intellectually and socially. That's what we meant by American exceptionalism. I think that sense is gone to the point that I simply don't know what people mean when they mock American exceptionalism. I mean, I never hear American exceptionalism defended anymore.
Sure.
But I also, when I hear it mocked, I don't know what it seems to mean. Something vague like America was great, or something very vague like that. Whereas in origin, it had a very specific meaning, that we are not retracing the path of Europe. The line of the line one sometimes hear, I can't remember who it's from, says fascism is always descending on the United States and landing in Europe. Is an expression of that old sense of American exceptionalism, right? That there's a sort of healthy society here that gets these European bugs, but our antibody system tends to throw them off in a way that it doesn't in Europe. That was the idea of American exceptionalism. And the root of it was, in its original coinage, was to talk about religion, that America was a very religious nation. Peter Berger's old line from the 60s and 70s, he looked at India as the most religious country in the world and Sweden as the least religious. And he described America as a nation of Indians ruled by Swedes.
Okay,
that we had,
interesting.
And I'm not sure that's true anymore, but you can see that was this view that there was something odd about America, how long it maintained this Christian sense. I think there's something still strange about America, which is that it retains this religious sense. It just was taught from secularism and a variety of other sources that we've talked about to forget the religious origins of its spiritual anxiety.
And I would also add that, in my experience as an undergrad, at least, like so much of the way we were taught history, it was coming through a post-structuralist lens, which really makes no space for any kind of spiritual or any existential kind of realities. Like it's very very pragmatic, very positivist.
So that and this is, I think, exactly right. So that the two lines I offered for post-Protestantism to understand it, one was more for Puritanism. One was morphological. This is a perpetual possibility for humans. And the other was genealogical. It derives from the Puritans. A post-structuralist account would dismiss both of those. Neither of them are helpful. They would say, neither of them tells us what people are really doing. And I'm not going to go back to Claude Levi-Strauss and say that I'm a structuralist, but I am going to say, there is an ontological truth about the human. This is why I think abortion actually is important. And I've spent a lifetime in the pro-life movement because I think it speaks to the deepest ontological and metaphysical roots of what it is to be human. But I think that we need to understand that human beings are not recreated ab novo, that we don't get, Homo Civiticus or Homo Postmodernus, that we are actually just creating conditions, new conditions for the same old possibilities of human being to express themselves. And that's true both morphologically and it's true genealogically. Our history shapes us whether we know it or not, to certain forms. And our lack of knowing it, I think our lack of knowing history has injured us. It's left us in a condition that makes much of what's happening today inexplicable.
So I'm highly recommend to those listening that you check out An Anxious Age, because again, as I said before, when I first read it, it just opened my eyes up to a lot of what I was experiencing and gave me the tools and the language to really articulate it, which it just helped me to be more free and not to feel just confused by everything. And with that being said, I want to thank you, Dr. Joseph Bottum, for joining us. And we hope you'll listen again. Take care.
Thanks for having me. Let's do this again.
All right.